And what is striking to most scholars is that when you lay out the sources chronologically, over time, Jesus starts changing the sorts of things that he says. What you don't get is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus saying that he's God. And my point is, if the historical Jesus really did go around saying those things, it is inconceivable to me that our earliest sources fail to mention it. Mm-hmm. Like, they didn't think that part was important.
I mean, you wrote a book called How Jesus Became God. And of course, one of the key claims of the Gospels is Jesus claiming divinity, claiming to be God, and that takes different manifestations in different Gospels. But what's your view? Is your view that anything that looks like Jesus claiming some kind of divine status is more likely an amendment of the Jesus story than an original part?
So I wouldn't put it quite that simply. I mean, there are people today who claim to be God, and so I don't say they didn't say that, mm-hmm. because somebody wouldn't say that. People do say that, mm-hmm. And so the issue is always, how do you know what Jesus said? When it comes to the New Testament Gospels, we of course have the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as I was saying earlier, it looks like Matthew and Luke have both used Mark. Mark is probably our earliest account. Matthew and Luke are later. Matthew and Luke appear to have used some other source that we don't have anymore for a number of their sayings of Jesus. And scholars have called the source Q, and it doesn't matter to my argument whether you think Q existed or not. But Luke does say he had earlier sources, so it's not implausible that he had a source that had some of Jesus' sayings. And so what scholars do when trying to figure out what Jesus really said, once they acknowledge that maybe he didn't say everything, because we know Jesus didn't say everything that's attributed to him in the early church, because we have other Gospels that everybody agrees Jesus didn't say these things. Okay. So somebody's making up stories, and the question is, and people are changing stories, and so we have absolute evidence that there's no question about it. So the question is whether that happens in the four Gospels or not, or whether somehow they were protected mm-hmm. from ever recording anything that Jesus actually didn't ever say. Were they protected from that? And what is striking to most scholars is that when you lay out the sources chronologically, over time, Jesus starts changing the sorts of things that he says.
A lot of people assume Jesus always claimed to be God, but Bart Ehrman is showing us why that's not so simple. He explains that our earliest gospel, Mark, doesn't present Jesus as clearly divine the way John does, which came much later. Over time, the way Jesus talks in the Gospels shifts. In earlier accounts, Jesus is more like a prophet or a teacher. But in later ones, he starts saying things that sound more divine. That's important, because it shows how stories about Jesus evolved. Scholars agree that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus died, by people who weren't eyewitnesses. They also had different sources. Some we don't even have anymore. And it's a fact that people in the early church were adding, changing, or even making up stories. We see that in other Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. So if the stories changed over time, how can we be sure Jesus actually said he was God? That's the real question. Let's hear more from Bart to see how this all unfolded. He's about to share specific examples.
And so, for example, in Mark and in Q, which would be the sayings in Matthew and Luke not found in Mark, those would probably be our earliest sources. Jesus principally talks about the kingdom of God that's coming. There's a kingdom of God that's coming. You need to repent and prepare for it, because if you don't, you're going to be destroyed. If you are on the side of God, you'll enter into this kingdom and there'll be a glorious existence. And so Jesus is preaching about the coming kingdom of God in Mark and Q. When you get to the Gospel of John, Jesus no longer preaches about the kingdom of God. He doesn't tell people to repent in preparation for the coming of the kingdom of God. He doesn't say that you will be destroyed when the kingdom of God comes. The way he talks is different now. And rather than talking principally about God and the coming kingdom, he talks about himself, who he is. And so you get some of the most famous sayings of Jesus. Especially
I am the way, the truth, and the life.
The way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life.
The Good Shepherd.
Before Abraham was, I am. I and the Father are one. You get all of these claims, many of which have a component of divine identity connected with him. He's claiming to be a divine being. That's crystal clear in the narrative of John, because whenever Jesus will say, I and the Father are one, and the Jews will pick up stones to stone him to death for committing blasphemy. You don't have those stories in the earliest Gospels. And it's striking, and you have to explain. if Jesus did go around calling himself a divine being, if that really happened, as John says, John says it happened, and it's the major teaching of Jesus in John. If that's what happened, why isn't it in Mark or Q? Is it that they didn't think it was important to report that part of Jesus' teachings? Or a more plausible explanation for most people, for most critical scholars, a more plausible explanation is that over time, the Christians' understanding of Jesus changed, and they started seeing him as less of just a human Messiah and more as some kind of divine being over time. And as they saw him that way, they recorded his words in those ways. And so the later sayings of John are later representations of what later Christians said about Jesus rather than what the earliest Christians. And if you think the earliest Christians thought this about Jesus, why don't they record those sayings?
Bart Ehrman's point lines up with what a lot of historians and biblical scholars have been saying for decades. The way Jesus is portrayed changes over time because early Christian beliefs were evolving. The Gospel of Mark, written around 70 AD, doesn't show Jesus calling himself divine. Instead, he talks about God's kingdom and calls people to repent. That matches what we see in the hypothetical Q source as well, an early collection of Jesus' sayings with no claims to divinity. These are the earliest layers of the tradition, but by the time we get to the Gospel of John, written 20 to 30 years later, the message has shifted. Now Jesus talks about himself, his identity, his relationship to God, and his divine authority. That change reflects a growing belief among some Christians that Jesus wasn't just the Messiah, but something more. Historians like Larry Hurtado and James Dunn have traced this shift and shown that early Christian communities gradually developed a high Christology, where Jesus was eventually worshipped like God. But that view wasn't present at the beginning. Even the Apostle Paul, writing earlier than all four Gospels, never quotes Jesus claiming to be God. Instead, Paul talks about Jesus being exalted after his resurrection. So when Ehrman asks why these divine claims only show up in the later Gospel, he's pointing to something backed by history, text, and serious scholarship. Belief in Jesus' divinity grew over time. It wasn't part of the earliest message. Let's hear what Peter's response to all this is.
So this developmental idea in the Gospels and the earlier later traditions around Jesus are developing the idea in the words.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great example of showing how so much scholarship, while claiming to be historically neutral, is basically very philosophically driven. Because I think even as you tease out your chronology and your development, I mean, it's really interesting how it's all stacking up towards a system in which you don't get Jesus, claiming as much early on. And I think that it's been developing for a couple hundred years within scholarship, and it's so intertwined, the historical argumentation and the sort of slight philosophical nudges here and there, that it's really, really hard to unpick. But I would just say, let's take Mark's Gospel as an example. Mark begins with this opening, I'm going to send my messenger before your face, and it's all about, quoting the Old Testament, but with John the Baptist going before the face of Jesus, when, it's about, in Malachi, that it's from, the messenger going before the face of God. And so it's presenting Jesus as in that place of God. Next chapter, he's forgiving sins. A couple of chapters later, he's stilling the storm like only God does, and it's calling on themes from Jonah. A couple of chapters later, chapter 6, he's walking on the water like only God does in Job chapter 9, and then he gets to the boat and he says, "Be of courage, I am." It's pretty dramatic. I am there in Mark 6 verse 50. So it's not just that John's I am saying is slightly different, but there is precedent for them. And I'd want to say a lot of people see this as a systematic presentation of Jesus's very, very exalted status, such that people are wondering, who is this? They're asking this question, and the fact that it's doing it through a sort of more Socratic method of getting you to think who this is not, I mean, God's the only one who opens the eyes of the blind, and that's also something Jesus does, uniquely in the Gospel. So I'd want to say that all of these things come together to give you a very exalted portrait of Jesus.
So there's a consistency, as far as you're concerned, between those earlier, if you like, accounts in Mark.
I think the whole question of development, we've got to say, when we lay out sources and we say this comes before this and this, what actually are we basing that on? How much is historically verifiable? How much of it is philosophical system? How much of it is literary system, and what's fed into that? And I think all of those things have to be laid on the table so that you can be very clear about, when you're saying this is a fact, what's it actually based on?
Yeah, so I'd love to respond to that. I mean, Pete, when you start out by saying that this chronology, the development is based on a chronology that's driven by skepticism.
I didn't say driven by skepticism, but okay.
What did you say?
I think it's got an input of that.
Because I was just going on your chronology. I mean, you said earlier that you think Mark was the first gospel.
I haven't said that.
Oh, okay. You said that you thought John was the end of the first. It was the last gospel.
Yes, I have said that.
Which one do you think is first?
I don't have a view.
Okay. Would you agree John's later than the others?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's all. That's the only development I need, and I don't see why skepticism has anything to do with it. I mean, I believe this when I was an evangelical Christian, and so, but then you want to say that it's wrong to say that Jesus isn't portrayed as divine in Mark because of all these other things.
And I know you can go through them one by one.
No. I mean, there are things you say that aren't true. I mean, it's not true that only God can heal the blind. Prophets do it all the time. Faith healers do it. So they do it with the power of God.
In the Old Testament?
Yes. So, and in the New Testament, I mean...
where in the Old Testament people heal the blind?
Well, in Jewish tradition, it's all over the place.
Yeah, but not in the Old Testament.
Yes. But why would you say that only God can heal the blind? I mean, I know people who say they were blind that have... I'm
trying to think, in the Old Testament, where are there people who heal the blind other than God?
I don't know of any.
There aren't any.
So... But I didn't say anything about that.
So I was saying, sorry.
Go ahead.
In the Old Testament portrayal, only God heals the blind, and then Jesus comes along and does it. That's
but so do other Jewish healers.
I think it's significant the way Jesus is portrayed. If you think about the
it doesn't make somebody divine to be able to heal somebody. You have healers throughout history. They aren't God. They're empowered by God.
But I think that... the signs in the message to John the Baptist is one of the things.
Okay. So that's just a side point. I just don't think it's true. Yeah. But it doesn't really matter. You're saying that Mark portrays Jesus as divine, and that has no bearing on what I was saying. I didn't deny that. I think that Mark does see Jesus as divine. What I'm asking is, what did Jesus himself say about himself? Now. You pointed out things like John the Baptist looking to Jesus, Jesus walking in the water, Jesus healing the blind. I mean, we could talk about each of all those, but I'm agreeing that Mark portrays Jesus as divine. My question is, did Jesus go around Palestine, Galilee, and then Judea, saying, I and the Father are one? Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. These are sayings found in the Gospel of John, which you agree is the last of the Gospels. Those sayings are not found in Mark, which you agree is an earlier Gospel. And they're not only found not in Mark. They're not found in Luke. They're not found in Matthew. They're not from Q. They're not in any of the early sources where Jesus says these things. When you pointed out that in Mark's gospel, people continually are asking, who is this? The answer is never, he is God. And Jesus himself never says, I am God in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or their sources.
I totally agree on that. I mean, there could be all sorts of reasons not to say that. But what I want to say is there is precedent for all of the I am sayings. So, for instance, Jesus, I am the bread of life. He says in the synoptics, this is my body, take this bread. He says, I am the good shepherd in John, and then he's portraying himself in stories as basically fulfilling the role of the shepherd. He says, I am the light of the world in John. In Matthew, he says, you are the light of the world to his disciples. If he's prepared to accept they're the light of the world, I don't see why he can't say that he is as well. So I think all of these things we can make connections, and I don't think yes. The Gospels are about 9 hours long when you read them in English. So in this 2-hour section of John, there are things which aren't in the others. But don't build a massive, castle out of that. I mean, it seems to me, of course, there are going to be some things that are in one that aren't in the others.
I agree with that.
Peter says Mark shows Jesus doing things only God can do, like healing the blind or calming storms. But in Jewish tradition, prophets like Elijah and Elisha did miracles without being divine. There's no verse in the Old Testament that says only God can heal blindness. That idea developed later. He also points to Jesus saying, "I am" in Mark 6, but in Greek, ego eimi just means "it's me." It doesn't carry the same weight as in John, where it echoes God's name in Exodus 3:14, and people try to kill Jesus for it. That doesn't happen in Mark, which shows it's not the same kind of claim. Most importantly, Ehrman asks the right question. If Jesus actually said things like, "I and the Father are one," why does no early source mention it? Not Mark, Q, Matthew, Luke, or even Paul. The simplest answer is those sayings developed later, as belief in Jesus grew. We can almost get who has the stronger argument here. Let's hear what they have to say until the end.
I'm not trying to build a castle out of it because I'm just responding to Justin's question. This wouldn't be a point that I would have raised. I mean, I don't. This wouldn't be. This is not why I think the Gospels are unreliable. So this isn't. For me, this isn't even the point. But I will say that the whole idea of development is that there are things earlier that get developed later, and so the fact that you see things earlier that could lead to John's proclamations that's what the developmental view is. What you don't get is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus saying that he's God. And my point is, if the historical Jesus really did go around saying those things, it is inconceivable to me that our earliest sources fail to mention it. Like, they didn't think that part was important. This would be the most significant thing to say, and yet none of them, not just Mark, but Matthew and their sources, by the way. I mean, I don't know what you think, but virtually every scholar I know thinks that you've got Mark, and you've got Q, and you've got M, and you've got L, and then you've got Matthew, and you've got Luke themselves. You've got 6 sources before John. None of them has these things. And so are we supposed to think, well, yeah, that was just like a minor detail they decided not to get into?
Bart makes a critical point here that Peter doesn't really address. If Jesus actually claimed to be God during his lifetime, why do none of our earliest sources record it? We're talking about 6 different sources before the Gospel of John: Mark, Q, M, L, Matthew, and Luke. And not one of them includes Jesus saying things like, "I and the Father are one," or "Before Abraham was, I am." These aren't small statements. They would have been central if they were part of Jesus' real teachings. Yet they only appear in John, which was written nearly 60 years after Jesus' death. That's not an oversight. That's evidence of theological development. As Bart says, seeing small seeds of divinity in earlier texts doesn't mean Jesus claimed it himself. It shows how beliefs evolved after his death. Just like how later Christian communities gave him titles like Son of God or Logos, the sayings in John reflect what believers came to believe, not what Jesus historically said. Peter focuses on symbolism and hints, but Bart is asking the historical question: what did Jesus actually say about himself? And if the answer is nowhere in the earliest texts, it's reasonable to conclude he didn't claim divinity during his lifetime. We can almost get who has the stronger argument here. But what do you think? Do you believe Jesus really claimed to be God during his life, or is that something added by later believers? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this breakdown, like the video and subscribe for more historical deep dives.
I just find it completely implausible.
But I think, John doesn't have Jesus go around saying, "I am God," either. So I think...
I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am.
Yeah, these are big things. But, when you walk up to... okay, you may not believe it happened, but when it's portrayed as someone walking up to people on the water and then saying, "I am," it's a pretty dramatic thing, isn't it?
In the Gospel of John, the man born blind is asked, "Were you the one who was born blind?" And he replies, "Ego eimi."
Sure.
I am.
Sure.
saying I am is just a way of saying yes.
Yeah, but it's not just that when you just walked across the water. It's something different.
Peter
It's
walked
something
on the
more.
water too.
Yeah, but
Okay, did that make him God?
No, again, but there is a
But
difference.
he was the one who fell down, of course. I mean,
Exactly. He wasn't exactly within the story. But Peter doesn't go around saying
But
I am.
what do you think Mark 6 is about when Jesus walks on the water? I mean, isn't this portraying
He's showing that God. I think Mark understands Jesus as a divine being. The basic story, I think, is absolutely reliable in the Gospels. But I think in addition to the broad outlines of the things that Jesus did, said, and experienced, there are large numbers of inconsistencies, contradictions, non-historical accounts that make these Gospels unreliable in many, many ways. There are lots of details that are unreliable, I think, in the Gospels, but I'm not going to focus on the details because they might be interesting if you really want every single word to be right. I'm interested in the major ways for this debate that the Gospels seem to me to be unreliable, involving three big issues that I'll try to address in my time. Issues connected with Jesus' birth, Jesus' resurrection, and Jesus' teaching or preaching. Okay, so that's what I'll be talking about, those three areas. And I'm going to start with the birth. Jesus was born to the Virgin in Bethlehem. What are our sources of information for the birth of Jesus? Just in the New Testament. We don't have sources from outside the New Testament that are going to help us much for any of this material. We're restricted to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what are our sources of information about Jesus' birth in the New Testament? Well, we have an account of Jesus' birth in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 1 and 2. We have an account in Luke, chapter 1 and 2. Those are the only passages in the entire New Testament that talk about Jesus' birth in Bethlehem to a virgin. That's interesting. Matthew and Luke don't talk about the birth outside of those first two chapters. They don't refer back to it. And what about other sources in the New Testament? They don't mention it. The virgin birth, of course, is a huge doctrine in the history of Christianity. In my part of the world, in the American South, Protestant evangelicals often say that if you don't believe in the virgin birth, you can't be a Christian. Why aren't there other parts of the New Testament that even talk about it? It's an interesting question that I think a lot of people haven't thought about. Why isn't there any account of Jesus' birth in our first gospel, the Gospel of Mark? Why isn't there one in the Gospel of John? Why doesn't he say anything about Jesus being born of a virgin? What about the Apostle Paul? Why doesn't he talk about the virgin birth? There are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul. There's not a word about the virgin birth. There are 27 books in the New Testament. 25 of them don't say anything about it. That's interesting. Well, why? The bigger question I'm going to address, though, is how do we explain the differences between the two accounts that we do have? There are lots of differences between these two accounts. People don't realize this because, we hear the Christmas story every year and we sort of smash it all together in our heads. But when you actually read the accounts, it's pretty interesting. Read Matthew's account and just make a list of what happens. Then read Luke's account, make a list of what happens, and then compare your two lists. There are lots of differences. Many of them may not matter to you. Matthew has the wise men coming visit Jesus. Luke has the shepherds. Matthew has Jesus' family escaping to Egypt. Luke has the presentation at the temple and the circumcision. These are differences, but they're just different. That doesn't mean they're contradictory. There are some potential problems, though. Some potential contradictions that I think actually are real contradictions. They involve Bethlehem and Nazareth. The similarity. Matthew and Luke both agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but that he was raised in Nazareth. Nazareth is about 100 miles, 80 miles, 100 miles north of Bethlehem. Discrepancies in these two accounts. This one I'm not going to go into, but if you want to look for yourself, just look at the two genealogies. One in Matthew chapter 1 and the other in Luke chapter 3. And ask yourself, who actually was Jesus' grandfather? Was it Jacob or Heli?
And who is his great-grandfather and his great-great-grandfather? The different genealogies all the way back to David. Is Jesus descended from David's son Solomon or David's son Nathan? Depends which one you read. Well, that's interesting. Just look for yourself and you'll see. I'm more interested in the question of why Bethlehem and why Nazareth, according to these two accounts. So here's how it works. Matthew chapters 1 and 2. In the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph and Mary start out in Bethlehem. Mary gives birth in Bethlehem, and there's a star that is leading the wise men to Jesus. The wise men are coming from the east, and they follow the star, and the star apparently stops over Jerusalem. They go into Jerusalem and ask, where's the King of the Jews to be born? And the inquiries get to the king, King Herod. Herod asks his wise men, and not his scripture scholars, to tell the wise men, and it turns out that the scriptures say that the King of the Jews is to be born in Bethlehem. And so the wise men then follow the star, reappears somehow, and it stops over the house. That's interesting. It stops over the house that Jesus is being born in. How's the star stop over a house exactly? Go out tonight and look up at the stars and tell me, which house is that star over? And it doesn't do much good if it's a comet or a supernova or anything else. I mean, so it can't be really a star. It must be something else, but that's fine. What happens, though, is they come in and worship Jesus, and they offer their three gifts. They're going to go home then, and they learn by an angel that they can't go back to Jerusalem to tell Herod because he's out to kill the child. And so they go some other way, and Herod sends out the troops to kill the child. They kill all the children. The troops kill all the male children in Bethlehem, the slaughter of the innocents. That, by the way, is a very interesting story. There's no record of that. There's no record of that happening in any ancient document other than this. You would think that would be in the newspaper. Joseph and Mary learn that the Herod's after the child, and so they escape to Egypt. They get out of there to escape Herod, and they go to Egypt. And of course, if you're going to Egypt from Bethlehem, you got to walk. I mean, you can't take a train, and so it takes a while to get there. And they're in Egypt until Herod dies. And when Herod dies, they start to return, but they realize they can't go back to Judea, where Bethlehem is, in the south of what we think of as Israel. And so they relocate to Nazareth. And that's why Jesus is born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, in Matthew. Luke has a very different account. In Luke, Joseph and Mary start in Nazareth. That's where they're from, and it turns out there's a worldwide census. The Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus has decided that the entire world has to register for a census, and so everybody has to go to their ancestral home. Joseph has to go to Bethlehem to register for the census because he's from the lineage of King David. And King David came from Bethlehem. Now, this is a very weird phenomenon just on the surface of it. How is it that everybody... Joseph was 1,000 years after David. Everybody's going to where their ancestors were 1,000 years earlier to register for a census? According to Luke, it's the census of the entire world. Well, that can't be right. It must be the Roman Empire. Okay, the entire Roman Empire. Everybody's going to their ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier? How does that work? I mean, suppose the Democrats just really take over everything next time, and they decide, we all need to register for a tax, because you know how much they like to tax people, and so, they got to go register, and you've got to go to register for this tax. You've got to go to where your ancestors came from 1,000 years ago. Where are you going to go? Really? And the entire population's doing this, and it doesn't get reported in the newspaper? There is no record of this anywhere, except for Luke. Well, Mary gives birth in Bethlehem, and 8 days later, Jesus is circumcised, and then 32 days after that, they go to the temple to present a sacrifice as commanded in the book of Leviticus, chapter 12. So it's 40 days later, and then after that, 40 days after birth, Mary gives her offering, and then they return home to Nazareth. Wait a second. In Matthew, they flee to Egypt. How do they go home 40 days later in Luke if they're on their way to Egypt? And they stay in Egypt until Herod dies. And then they can't come back to Judea because the next ruler is worse than Herod. And so this is months and months, years, I don't know, but Luke says they went back 40 days later. How can that possibly be right? They can't both be right. The deal is that either one of them is right and the other is wrong and therefore unreliable, or they're both wrong and therefore both unreliable. They both can't be right.
Historians widely agree that the birth stories in Matthew and Luke aren't reliable history. And here's why. First, no Roman census ever required people to return to their ancient ancestral hometowns, let alone a town from 1,000 years earlier like Bethlehem. Roman records show censuses were taken for taxation and military control, and people registered where they lived. It would have been a logistical nightmare to do what Luke describes, and there's zero evidence it ever happened. Second, the massacre of infants in Bethlehem, described only in Matthew, isn't recorded by Josephus, the most detailed first-century historian who chronicled Herod's reign. Josephus documented Herod's many crimes, including killing his own sons, but never mentioned mass infanticide, which would have stood out. Finally, the genealogies in Matthew and Luke are different, not just in names, but in how Jesus is linked to David, one through Solomon, the other through Nathan. These contradictions make it impossible to claim both are historically accurate. So Ehrman's point is backed by solid evidence and mainstream biblical scholarship. Let's hear more. Let's watch again.
How do the disciples of Jesus learn that he's been raised from the dead? In each gospel. Simply read them yourselves, you'll see. In the Gospel of Mark, we're explicitly told that the women go to the tomb, they learn that he's been raised from the dead. They are told to go tell his disciples that he's been raised and he will meet them in Galilee. And the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. Period. The gospel stops there. They didn't tell anyone. That's the end of the Gospel of Mark. In Matthew, I should have put Matthew here, Matthew, Luke, and John, the women go to the tomb, they hear that Jesus has been raised, they're supposed to go tell the disciples, and they go right away and they tell. Well, which is it? Where do the disciples go if they go anywhere? Mark and Matthew, Mark presupposes that they're supposed to go to Galilee. Matthew says they go to Galilee, and that's where they meet Jesus. But in Luke, the women hear about Jesus being raised, and then Jesus appears to two followers the same day, we're told. The women go tell the disciples, and while they're talking to the disciples, Jesus shows up on the same day, and then he takes them out, and he tells them, don't leave Jerusalem. In the south. Don't leave Jerusalem. Stay in Jerusalem until you receive the Spirit. When you get to the next book written by the same author, Acts, they're in Jerusalem 40 days later. And they stay in Jerusalem after that. Jesus appears to them in Jerusalem and tells them not to leave, and they don't leave for months. In Matthew, they go straight to Galilee. How could it be both? It can't be both. Where do they see Jesus? Do they see Jesus anywhere? Not in Mark. In Mark, the women don't even tell anybody. In Matthew, they see Jesus only in Galilee. They make a trip up to Galilee, they go up to Galilee, they're in Galilee. They see Jesus and then he leaves them. In Luke, however, they see him only in Jerusalem and Jesus tells them, don't leave Jerusalem. And they stay in Jerusalem. They see Jesus and then he ascends to heaven. Well, how can they... Just read them yourself. They differ from each other in a way that can't be reconciled. How can all of these accounts be right?
The resurrection stories in the Gospels contradict each other in ways that historians take seriously. For example, the earliest Gospel, Mark, ends with the women fleeing the tomb in fear and telling no one. That's in the oldest manuscripts. The later verses people often read were added much later, centuries after. Now compare that to Luke. Luke says Jesus appears that very day in Jerusalem and tells the disciples to stay put. That directly conflicts with Matthew, where Jesus appears in Galilee, 70 miles north, and gives the Great Commission. Even more, Acts, written by the same author as Luke, says Jesus stayed for 40 days after the resurrection, yet that's not mentioned in Matthew or Mark. It looks like later writers reshaped the story over time to fit different theological points. This isn't a small detail. When key moments like where and when Jesus appeared vary this much, historians can't treat the resurrection stories as consistent eyewitness accounts. Let's hear what Jimmy has to say about whether the Gospels are historically reliable.
And I would propose, in light of that, that a source may be judged historically reliable if we can verify many of its major claims, many of its intermediate claims, and many of its lesser claims. So if we can check it out and show, wow, a bunch of its major claims and intermediate claims and lesser claims, they're accurate, then we can judge it to be historically reliable. Until we've seen enough errors to counterbalance this. So if you see a picture like this, with lots of verified claims on the major, intermediate, and minor levels, then you can judge that document historically reliable. Now, of course, you need to understand how to read the document. Like if it's an ancient document, you need to know how ancient sources worked so you can interpret it correctly. And I'll have more to say about that in my second statement. But for the moment, let's look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and see what we can determine about their reliability. Well, here's a list of major claims that the Gospels make. Jesus existed. Jesus was a Jew. He lived in the 1st century in Roman Palestine. He had a reputation as a teacher on both moral and prophetic subjects. He gathered disciples, including an inner circle of 12 disciples. He was crucified, and the man who put him to death, the man who ordered him crucified, was the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. So, how can we evaluate these claims? Well, I'd love to be able to present you with all the evidence I'm aware of, but I've got 11 minutes left in this opening statement. So, I'm going to have to do something else. And fortunately, we have with us tonight Bart Ehrman. See, he's right up there. And he's also right here, incarnate, as it were. So, what does Bart Ehrman make of these major gospel claims? Well, one thing, as a historian, he's not going to say that a historical document ever gives you absolute certainty about what happened in the past, but it will give you probabilities. And so even though he wouldn't say that we have ontological certitude that certain things happened about Jesus, he will say the Gospels are probably right about some things. In fact, he already said it in his opening statement. And sometimes he'll say they're very, very probably right. So what about that first major gospel claim, that Jesus existed? Well, Bart Ehrman says that's right. In fact, he wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist?, in which he combats mythicists, Jesus mythicists who say Jesus didn't really exist, he was just a myth. Bart wrote an entire book refuting that point of view, and I think he deserves credit. Let's give Bart a big hand of applause. Thank you. And this is something that Bart and I agree about. Jesus really existed. High five. Yeah! So, Bart agrees that Jesus existed. What does he think about these other major claims? Well, without making too long of a point of it, he thinks that the Gospels are right when they say Jesus was a Jew who lived in the 1st century in Palestine, who was a teacher on moral subjects, on prophetic subjects, who gathered disciples, who had an inner circle of 12 disciples, who was crucified, and who was sent to his crucifixion by Pontius Pilate. So Bart agrees on all these major gospel claims. Well, what about intermediate claims, things of a slightly lesser scale in the Gospels? Well, the Gospels say that Jesus lived in the 1st century, but more specifically, they indicate he was an adult in the AD 20s. Bart Ehrman says that's right. The Gospels indicate Jesus lived in Roman Palestine, but more specifically, they say he came from Nazareth. Bart says that's right. The Gospels say Jesus was connected with John the Baptist. Bart agrees. Jesus was baptized at the beginning of his ministry, according to the Gospels. Bart agrees. John the Baptist was the one who did the baptism, and Bart agrees. What about John the Baptist himself? Well, the Gospels indicate that John preached a message of coming destruction and salvation. Bart says that's right. The Gospels also indicate that Jesus agreed with John the Baptist's message. Bart says that's right too. Jesus not only was a teacher, but one of the ways he taught was in parables, according to the Gospels. Bart says that's right. One of Jesus' major themes in his teaching was the kingdom of God, and Bart said that, in fact, in his opening statement. Jesus believed that he was the king of that coming kingdom, or the Messiah. And Bart says Jesus did believe that. Jesus taught that there was a coming reversal of fortunes where the exalted would be humbled and the humble would be exalted, according to the Gospels and according to Bart Ehrman. Jesus didn't think that you needed to scrupulously observe the Mosaic Law in the way that some thought you did. Bart agrees. Also, Jesus believed that the heart of the Mosaic Law was the love of God and the love of neighbor. Bart signs off on that too. And Jesus believed that the way to attain the kingdom was through love of God and neighbor. Once again, the Gospels and Bart agree. Because Jesus' teachings were different than other Jewish teachers, Jesus was in conflict with them. He also spent much of his preaching ministry in Galilee. But at the end of the ministry, he went to Jerusalem for Passover, and he predicted the destruction of the temple, and he was betrayed to the Jewish authorities. He had a follower named Judas. Judas was the man who betrayed him to the Jewish authorities. The Jewish authorities then handed him over to Pilate, and Pilate had him crucified for calling himself the King of the Jews. On all of these points, the Gospels are probably right, according to Bart Ehrman. So Bart not only agrees that the major claims we covered are accurate, but all of these intermediate ones as well.
Yes, many of the Gospel's big-picture claims are likely true. Jesus existed, he was Jewish, he taught, he was crucified. Bart Ehrman agrees, and so does nearly every serious historian. But here's the catch. Acknowledging those broad facts doesn't make the Gospels historically reliable overall. A document can include true claims and still contain major historical problems. That's the case here. When core events like Jesus' birth and resurrection are told in contradictory ways, it raises red flags. And when key theological ideas like the virgin birth or post-resurrection appearances are completely absent from most of the New Testament, it suggests these ideas developed over time, rather than being uniformly known or witnessed. The Gospels aren't neutral biographies. They're written decades later, shaped by theology, not just memory. So while they preserve some real history, the inconsistencies matter, especially when evaluating reliability as a whole.
I want to make it very clear that I'm not postulating a sort of God of the gaps this evening to plug up holes in scientific knowledge. Rather, my claim is that science can provide evidence for a premise in an argument leading to the conclusion that God exists.
Philosophers and their obfuscating cousins, their theologians, has puzzled for centuries over the purpose of the universe. Why did God make it? Boredom with absolutely nothing? Anxious for admirers? Keen that we should have the pleasures and the pains of existence? The trouble is, there is absolutely no evidence that the universe has any purpose whatsoever. Now, as you've just heard, some assert that a universe can spring from a quantum fluctuation. That may be true of a daughter universe, for an already existing mother universe has physical laws and a richly propertied vacuum. But when there is absolutely nothing, there are no physical laws, no quantum fluctuation. It's an empty term for the emergence of an original universe. And to make things harder for myself, but with an eye on trying to answer and not evade a deeply important question, I shall set aside the simpler problem of a daughter universe and consider the formation of an original universe. Did that original universe, although perhaps contingent, have to be caused? You have to realize that physical laws, which are summaries of observed behavior, come into existence as a universe comes into existence. That includes issues of causality. It is naive in the extreme to extrapolate our own experience of causality, which is essentially the working out of the consequences of physical laws, to an era before those laws existed. It is entirely possible that the unique event that marked the inception of the physical laws was itself an uncaused event. And what science has to do, in due course, is to discover how absolutely nothing can tumble into being and become apparently something. Is there any reason to believe that it might succeed? There's no doubt that it's actually edging towards that goal by burrowing back in time to discover that there was what there was immediately after the creation event. Look how far it has come in the past 100 years. We're starting to be confident about what first appeared, and we're certainly becoming aware of what needs to be known, such as refinements and perhaps replacements of general relativity and quantum theory. Once we know the nature of the newly formed universe, we can begin to speculate, as some actually already have, about the nature of the events that has given us the impression that there is something here in place of absolutely nothing. To say that we now have any knowledge at all about how it could happen would be a lie. But to say at this stage, and after so much progress, that God did it, would be a premature admission of defeat. There is currently no need for a creator God. Secondly, fitness. One role of God, it is argued, is to choose the values of the fundamental constants so that images of him can emerge. I will discount the evidence that God has an apparently greater interest in ensuring the presence of gas and rocks rather than organisms, and concede the fact that this universe has properties that allow for the emergence of life. There are two principal arguments that throw into doubt that a thoughtful God was involved in the design of the universe. First, it could be the case that only a certain mix of fundamental constants could come into existence for a viable universe, and the fact that they allow life is just a happy accident. Second, it could be the case, and theoretical models give some credence to it, that ours is not the only universe. And if there is more than one universe, then there is no obvious reason why there is not an infinite number of universes. Why stop at 2? Why stop at 42? It could be that all those universes have the same mix of fundamental constants, each one allowing life. Or it could be that the fundamental constants take random values, and it is inevitable that one, or even an infinity of them, permit the emergence of life. No design appears to be necessary, and an argument that posits an essential designer God is lazy rather than convincing. There is currently no need for a designer God.
What Atkins is saying lines up with modern cosmology. Quantum physics shows us that particles can emerge from what looks like nothing. The Casimir effect is one example, where measurable forces arise in a vacuum due to quantum fluctuations. Physicists like Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss have argued that universes can originate from quantum states without needing a divine push. When Christians claim God fine-tuned the universe, it ignores two things. First, the universe is mostly hostile to life. 99.9999% is empty space, radiation, and gas. If it was designed for humans, it's a very inefficient design. Second, theories like eternal inflation and string theory predict multiverses, where different universes could have different constants. In that case, life existing here is just statistical inevitability, not evidence of design. Historically, invoking God to explain gaps in knowledge has failed. People once believed lightning, disease, and earthquakes were divine acts until science explained them. This is exactly what God of the gaps thinking looks like. Even the Bible reflects pre-scientific cosmology, a flat earth under a firmament in Genesis 1:6-8, which shows it isn't a reliable source of cosmology.
Thirdly, purpose. Philosophers and their obfuscating cousins, the theologians, has puzzled for centuries over the purpose of the universe. Why did God make it? Boredom with absolutely nothing? Anxious for admirers? Keen that we should have the pleasures and the pains of existence? The trouble is, there is absolutely no evidence that the universe has any purpose whatsoever. This, like causality, is an extrapolation of puny human experience to an inappropriate cosmic scale. Each of us, of course, has purposes of various kinds, and so surely, they say, the universe has one too. Science proceeds to elucidate the workings of the world without invoking purpose, and finds not one jot of evidence for it. In fact, in my view, there is a grandeur in an entity as great as a universe, just hanging there, wholly without purpose. And if there is no purpose, there is no need to posit a purposeful God. Fourthly, miracles. I shall adopt the perhaps naive but common view that a miracle involves the suspension of natural law. Miracles of that kind have never, ever been observed. There is not one atom of reliable evidence that God has ever intervened in the world to suspend his laws. That the path to canonization requires physicians to certify that an event cannot be explained except by God responding to intercession by a candidate saint should result in the physicians being struck off for incompetence if they aver that a cure has no natural explanation. Even that great, pivotal, purported miracle, the resurrection, is a total fabrication, with other explanations far more cogent than anything divine. Even given that Jesus existed and was crucified, was he merely in a coma? Was his disappearance a cover-up for political reasons? Was it Golgotha Gate? Did the women forget which of the many post-crucifixion holes in the ground he was buried in? The Gospels are wholly unreliable, being politically motivated propaganda manifestos written long after the events they purport to report. As no miracle has ever occurred, to assert that miracles are evidence for God is an empty argument. Theodicy. That an all-loving God permits evil to stalk the world, including, most dreadfully, the unconscious evil of evolution by natural selection, has puzzled theologians since the beginning of time, and all manner of convoluted explanations have been proposed. There is, of course, an extraordinarily simple explanation. There is no all-loving God. Indeed, to anyone with an open mind, the existence of evil, the torment, accident and neighbor visited upon the innocent, is in fact evidence against the existence of God. Morality. My sixth and final point. God is commonly presumed to be the fountainhead of love, and as such, the source of the distinction between good and evil. In my view, the distinction has emerged in the course of our evolutionary history. But it It is not, it's not just the consequence of red in tooth and claw. Red in tooth and claw is coated in the milk of human kindness by our emerging ability to consider the consequences of our actions. To discover the roots of ethics, we might consult the so-called holy books for a variety of anecdotes and experiences that might match our own. But to understand the source of the distinction, we need to examine our ethological history, perhaps history itself, and certainly anthropology and psychology. Just as good manners have emerged for the sake of decorum and the avoidance of offense, so good behavior has emerged for the sake of survival. It is childish to presume that there is an umpire God, and adult to consider how our actions stabilize society. I've considered some of the arguments that purport to establish the existence of God and have shown that they carry little force. In every case, there is a more cogent, or at least greater the likelihood of discovering a more cogent explanation. I can understand why the notion of God has arisen and persisted, for it provides a simple, purported explanation of great matters. It is a comfort blanket for the anxious and deprived, and it is a powerful weapon of control. You have a choice: to accept on faith alone that there is a God and lie back, luxuriating in the foam of satisfaction. There is no longer any need to think. For why pursue the incomprehensible any further than comforting assertion? Or you can take delight in the power of the collective human intellect, an intellect that burrows into experiences, is currently in hot pursuit of comprehension on this side of the grave, and adds to life the delight of true understanding. Thank you very much.
When Atkins points out that the universe shows no purpose, science backs that up. The cosmos is mostly chaos, supernovae, black holes, an endless void. If there were a divine plan, it's strange that 99.9% of creation is hostile to life. Miracles don't solve this problem either. No verifiable miracle has ever been documented. The resurrection, often cited as proof, is recorded in texts written decades later, with contradictions between Gospels and no independent evidence. As David Hume argued, it's always more likely the testimony is flawed than that natural law was suspended. Then there's the problem of evil. Earthquakes, disease, and the brutality of evolution all suggest indifference, not divine love. Even Christian thinkers like Augustine struggled with this, but their answers never resolved why innocent suffering is allowed by an all-powerful God. Finally, morality is better explained by evolution and society than by religion. Studies in evolutionary psychology show cooperation and empathy helped humans survive long before Christianity existed. And the Bible itself permits slavery and violence, proving it's not the source of universal ethics.
First, that there are good reasons to think that theism is true, and secondly, that there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. Now let's turn to that second contention, that there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. In his opening speech, Dr. Atkins more or less admitted this. He said that I cannot prove that God does not exist. I can only show that God is not necessary. Well, now notice that merely leaves you with agnosticism, that is to say, the position that you don't know whether or not God exists. And that's not incompatible with the existence of God or even Christian theism. Indeed, many Christian theologians hold the position that there aren't good arguments for God's existence. I disagree with them, but nevertheless, that's consistent with a Christian position. So, at most, we're left with agnosticism. Secondly, Dr. Atkins also says that he rejects any sort of God of the gaps approach. There's nothing in the universe that cannot be scientifically explained. Now, he admits that's merely a promissory note. He takes that by faith. But nevertheless, I want to make it very clear that I'm not postulating a sort of God of the gaps this evening to plug up holes in scientific knowledge. Rather, my claim is that science can provide evidence for a premise in an argument leading to the conclusion that God exists. For example, in my cosmological argument, there's scientific evidence for that key premise that the universe began to exist. So science does help, I think, to establish theism, not directly but indirectly by supplying evidence for a premise in a philosophical argument leading to a theological conclusion. And so I want to insist as clearly as I can that this is not a debate between science and religion tonight. On the contrary, I think that science provides good evidence for premises in arguments that have theologically significant conclusions. Finally, he does allude very briefly to the problem of evil, saying that this makes it unlikely that God exists. Now, what Dr. Atkins seems to be saying here, although he didn't flesh out this argument, is there's some kind of an inconsistency between the statement God exists and evil exists. But the problem is those two statements are not logically contradictory with each other. And therefore, the atheist must be assuming some implicit premises, some hidden assumptions that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit. The problem is no atheist has ever been able to identify what those hidden premises are. And if Dr. Atkins knows what they are, then I will ask him to please share them with us and to show us that those premises are necessarily true, because unless and until he does that, he hasn't shown any incompatibility between God and the evil in the world. Indeed, I would say that we can actually go one step further. We can actually show that God and the evil in the world are consistent. To do that, all you need to do is find a third statement that is composable or consistent with God's existence that entails that evil exists. Here's such a statement. God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. As long as that is even possibly true, it shows that God and evil are logically consistent with each other. So Dr. Atkins would have to show us that it is impossible that God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing the evil in the world. And in so doing, he will have taken on a burden of proof that is simply unsustainable by the atheist. The prominent metaphysician Peter Van Inwagen says, "It used to be held that evil was incompatible with the existence of God, that no possible world contained both God and evil. So far as I am able to tell, this thesis is no longer defended, not even by atheists." So we've not heard any good arguments for atheism this evening. What about my arguments on behalf of theism? First, I argued that the origin of the universe points to the existence of God. I argued first that the universe began to exist, and I presented both philosophical arguments and scientific evidence in support of that premise, and Dr. Atkins doesn't deny it. Then I said, if the universe did begin to exist, then there was a transcendent cause of the universe which brought it into being. And here Dr. Atkins says, well, science can't explain how nothingness can turn into something, but he hopes that eventually it will. Now, it needs to be understood, first of all, that Professor Atkins is asking the wrong question. The question is not how nothing can turn itself into something. That is to treat nothingness as though it were something. But nothingness isn't anything. It has no properties, no powers, no potentialities. It can't turn itself into anything. The question, rather, is why did the universe come into being? Why did the universe begin to exist? We're looking for a cause of the universe. And what Professor Atkins says in his book on being is that, in fact, the universe never really began to exist because nothing exists. He says the positive and negative energy in the universe balance each other out, and thus on balance there is zero energy, and therefore really nothing exists. Not you, not me, not Professor Atkins, not the universe. Nothing exists, and therefore there's nothing to explain. Now, I want to say, first of all, this is a really bad argument. Just because there's positive and negative energy in the universe doesn't mean that, therefore, there's nothing. That would be like saying that if I've got 10 pounds in my wallet and I owe you 10 pounds, then in fact I've got nothing in my wallet, which is absurd. Just because on balance I have no financial statement of a positive nature doesn't mean I don't have any money or that money doesn't exist. And thus Christopher Isham, who is a quantum cosmologist at Imperial College, points out there still needs to be ontic seeding, as he puts it, to create the positive and negative energy in the first place. So this is a bad argument for nothing's existing. Secondly, I want to say, in any case, the conclusion is absurd. First of all, it's self-contradictory. If you say there is positive energy and there is negative energy, the is an existential is in those statements. You're saying there exists positive energy and there exists negative energy, and that contradicts the statement that nothing exists. So the position on its face is patently self-contradictory. Moreover, it is absurd to say that nothing exists. I at least exist. And I know that I exist. It's undeniable that you at least exist.
Craig tries to dismiss atheism as just agnosticism, but that misses the point. Admitting we don't know everything isn't weakness, it's honesty. Science works by following evidence, not by filling gaps with God. When Craig argues that evil and God are logically consistent, he ignores the scale of suffering. From the Black Death killing half of Europe to millions of children dying of preventable diseases every year, the claim that a loving God permits this out of some hidden purpose is unfalsifiable and meaningless. It's not evidence, it's an excuse. He also attacks the idea of a universe from nothing, but modern cosmology shows energy can emerge from quantum fluctuations, where positive and negative values balance out. This isn't philosophy, it's physics. The Casimir effect and Hawking radiation demonstrate this at small scales today. Saying God did it adds nothing to our understanding. History shows that every time religion claimed authority, from geocentrism to creationism, science eventually proved it wrong. Atheism isn't about certainty, it's about following the evidence wherever it leads, without assuming a divine conclusion. So here's the real question. Do we accept mystery as God, or do we embrace human curiosity to keep searching for real answers? Comment below with your thoughts. Hit like if this helped clarify the debate, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives like this one.